Good afternoon. On behalf of the board and staff at IMFG, I am delighted to welcome you all to today's virtual panel on redevelopment and equity, examining the impacts of revitalization in a resurgent Detroit. My name is Thomas Hatchard, and I'm the Manager of Programs and Research here at the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Although this event is virtual, and I realize that everyone is in a different location in Canada, and possibly elsewhere, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank the external funders of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maytree, the City of Toronto, the Region of Halton, and the Region of York. And I would also like to thank our team at IMFG and at Munk, Ahmed, Adam, and Daria for everything they did to make this event happen today. If you're tweeting about this event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is IMFG Toronto. Today's event is the first of two seminars in this academic year by our 2020-2021 postdoctoral fellow, Julie Ma. Julie is currently working on research for IMFG on affordable housing, but the presentation today is focused on her previous research in Detroit. Detroit, as many of you are likely aware, has been the site of significant redevelopment and revitalization, which is work that can have negative consequences, such as housing unaffordability, precarity, and both of which can be particularly the case for low-income residents. So what have been the impacts of regeneration initiatives in Detroit? How can planners be more proactive in anticipating negative impacts to ensure that the benefits of resurgence are equally distributed? Julie is going to walk us through these questions in her presentation. She's going to present for about half an hour, and then we are going to move straight into a Q&A. So please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and send in questions throughout the talk. So let me just introduce Julie. As I said, she's the 2020-21 IMFG postdoctoral fellow. She holds a PhD in planning from the University of Toronto, and her research focuses on affordable housing issues, evictions, gentrification and displacement, and equitable development approaches. Julie has also worked as a planning consultant on several community improvement plans, cultural plans, and economic development strategies. Julie, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Thomas, for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. We'll get into it. Yes, and thank you everyone for attending the webinar today. So as Thomas mentioned, I'm going to discuss a part of my dissertation research that I did in Detroit, which critically examines the social and housing impacts of regeneration initiatives in the greater downtown area. Specifically, I examine how the affordable housing opportunities of low-income households have been affected by intense redevelopment. So I'm often asked, why did I choose Detroit as a case study? Originally, my plan was to study Windsor, but then my gaze went over the river to Detroit. And in the end, I chose the city because of its iconic status as an American shrinking city, and the fact that there's a large concentration of subsidized housing in the greater downtown. And given the intense redevelopment that was going on in the downtown and midtown areas, it presented an opportunity to examine the impacts of revitalization on the housing affordability landscape. And lastly, but most importantly, I chose Detroit because of the lessons it can offer to other places attempting to recover from years of economic and population decline. So I'll start by providing some brief historical context on Detroit. Next, I'll outline a select few regeneration initiatives that helped catalyze revitalization and development activity in the greater downtown. Then I'll present the social and housing impacts of that revitalization. And I'll conclude by discussing how we could broaden equitable development approaches to include a better understanding of indirect displacement. By doing so, this could help to proactively address the negative impacts of revitalization and ensure that everyone can benefit. We'll then open things up for Q&A, and I look forward to hearing your questions. So my inquiry started with this central research question. What are the social and housing impacts of recent regeneration initiatives in greater downtown Detroit? To address this question, I employed a mixed methods approach. The quantitative component featured multiple data sources, such as evictions data, building permits data, and census data. I then conducted data and spatial analysis at the census tract level, which was informed by qualitative interviews and then supplemented by extensive site visits and participant observation at public meetings. This qualitative component is based on a 3-month research trip to Detroit in 2016 and a follow-up trip in August 2017. So to provide some context, the story of Detroit is very much a story of race and racial division, and housing has been and continues to be a key site of racial conflict. The Detroit area has a history of racial segregation, and it remains a highly segregated region today. The gray dots in this map show the geographic distribution of the white population in the region. This large non-gray area is Detroit. And you can see that white residents mostly live in the more affluent suburbs surrounding the city. As most of you probably already know, Detroit has experienced severe population loss since its peak population in 1950 of 1.8 million residents. The city then lost over 1 million residents over the span of 60 years, but the suburbs surrounding the city gained over 1.9 million people. The result of this depopulation is that Detroit had about 80,000 vacant housing units as of 2010. 178,000 units were demolished from 1960 to 2000, and demolitions have continued in the city. This map shows the location of completed and planned demolitions from 2014 to March 2017. And you can see that most of the demolitions are occurring outside of the greater downtown, the study area. Since 2014, there have been over 16,000 demolitions in the city. After ongoing demolitions, this is now the face of Detroit's urban landscape in some neighborhoods. So there's no wonder that these are the typical pictures that have been associated with the popular decline narrative of Detroit: ruin, abandonment, disinvestment. Though if you visited Detroit in the last few years, you've probably been to the downtown and seen how this narrative of decline has now become a narrative of renaissance and revitalization. And indeed, there has been intense redevelopment in the downtown and midtown areas in recent years. There have been a number of built environment improvements and the creation of public amenities, such as the DeQuinder Cut Greenway and Campus Martius, which is a public square in the middle of downtown. And in 2017, they completed an LRT called the Q Line that runs along Woodward Avenue. And this is the equivalent of Yonge Street here in Toronto. And to give you a sense of the scale of reinvestment, just between 2013 and 2014, real estate development in the greater downtown totaled over $5 billion. This reinvestment has been fueled by a number of regeneration initiatives, but I'll only highlight a few today, such as the use of property tax abatements, grants from private philanthropic foundations, and the implementation of the anchor strategy in Midtown, which have helped to catalyze redevelopment and growth. In terms of property tax abatements, I'll outline 3 major programs. The Neighborhood Enterprise Zone, or NEZ, was enacted by the Michigan legislature to provide local communities with a place-based tool to stimulate new housing development and improvement in distressed communities. Under the Act, local governments designate areas as NEZs for the purpose of extending property tax abatements intended for residential construction and rehabilitation. The 138 NEZ new and rehabilitated districts, which are shown in green in the map, are mostly situated within the greater downtown and along the Jefferson corridor. And you can see that the location of many of these NEZ and R districts are situated in gentrifying areas, which are highlighted in blue on the map. Now, under the NR programs, property owners can obtain a substantial tax break. For example, for new construction, the NEZ rate is set at half the state average tax rate of the preceding year, which in 2016 would have been 16.96 mils. This represents a generous savings to beneficiaries when compared to Detroit's rate of 69.13 mils. These savings typically last 15 years, though it could go up to 17 years for a historic building. For a rehabilitated building, owners still pay the full tax rate, but the taxable value is frozen at pre-rehabilitation levels. The NEZ Homestead program, on the other hand, doesn't provide as generous a tax rebate as the NR program. Eligible homeowners save about $330 annually for the 15-year period, but they must commit to a minimum of $500 worth of home improvements in the first 3 years. Developers also use the Obsolete Property Rehabilitation Act, which helps incentivize the redevelopment of vacant and functionally obsolete buildings back into active commercial uses and housing projects. A typical tax abatement period is for 12 years, during which time the tax assessed value is frozen at the pre-rehabilitation level. Another incentive that has been well used by developers is the Commercial Rehabilitation Act, or CRA. The act subsidizes the rehabilitation of commercial property for commercial purposes or for a multi-family residential facility. And just to illustrate the level of public support that's involved in encouraging this redevelopment, I'll just briefly use Dan Gilbert as an example. So some of you probably have heard of Dan Gilbert. He's the founder of Quicken Loans, and he has been featured prominently in many news stories about Detroit's resurgence, and for very good reason. He moved his company's headquarters to downtown Detroit in 2010, and his family of companies employ about 17,000 people, which makes him one of the city's largest employers. He also owns over 100 properties downtown. In 2018, city staff tallied up all of the public subsidies that were sought and received by Gilbert's companies. And according to their research, the total value of public support his companies have received or requested from the city of Detroit is estimated to be almost $127 million. And this involves 15 projects with 27 tax abatements or incentives. Now, this report doesn't include the tax incentives from the state's recently enacted transformational brownfield tax credit. For an estimated investment of over $2 billion, Gilbert will receive $618 million in tax credits over 30 years for 4 major projects downtown. In Detroit, private philanthropic foundations have helped bring about revitalization through the funding of infrastructure improvements and upgrades. The Kresge Foundation, for example, is a prominent funder in Detroit. The $3.8 billion foundation took the lead in funding the extensive multi-year Detroit Future City Planning Project, the U3 Anchor Strategy, and the M1 light rail transit line along Woodward Avenue, which is now called the Q Line. From 2009 to 2015, Kresge has awarded 390 grants in Detroit, which were worth over $263 million. The majority of grants during that period went to projects that involved built environment improvements, parks redevelopment, housing development, and physical revitalization efforts. The Ford Foundation is also a major donor in Detroit. It has awarded over $272 million in grants from 2006 to 2018. The Kresge and Ford Foundations are also members of the Living Cities, which is a philanthropic collaborative that funded the Woodward Corridor Initiative, or WCI. And this initiative was launched in 2010 with $22 million worth of funding. And the purpose of the WCI was to revitalize neighborhoods adjacent to Woodward Avenue by increasing or helping to facilitate development activity and by encouraging in-migration to the Midtown area. So anchor institutions such as universities and hospitals possess significant investments in the built environment in the form of land holdings and buildings. They also tend to be major employers and have access to significant fiscal resources. As such, they have become important players in revitalization efforts, especially in localities with constrained funding. So for example, the major anchor institutions in Midtown, Wayne State University, Detroit Medical Center, and Henry Ford Health System, they employ almost 30,000 people and have annual operating expenses in excess of $1.5 billion. The Live Midtown program, which was established in 2011, is a well-publicized component of the anchor strategy and offers housing incentives for employees of these three major anchor institutions to either rent or purchase a property or make improvements on an existing property located in the Midtown program boundaries, which are shown in this map. So eligible employees seeking to purchase a home received a forgivable loan up to $20,000 over 5 years, while existing homeowners in the district received matching funds up to $5,000 for exterior home improvements. New renters received $2,500 toward the first year's rent, followed by an additional $1,000 for the second year. And existing renters received $1,000 for renewing a current lease. So the $4.2 million Live Midtown program ended in 2017. It involved almost 1,400 participants and was estimated to have generated a $22 million financial impact in rental payments and home purchases. These various regeneration initiatives have been successful in helping to spur development activity. And you can see the scale of development in this map. Using building permits data from 2010 to 2015, I calculated location quotients to determine where development activity has been geographically concentrated. The map clearly illustrates that there has been an intense redevelopment going on in the downtown and surrounding areas. During this intense redevelopment period, there has been substantial racial and social change in the downtown. Newcomers tend to be young white professionals. And you can see that there's been an almost 70% increase in the number of white residents during this period, while the Black population grew only by 5%. The 20 to 34-year-old group also grew substantially in the downtown as opposed to the city as a whole, and the number of professionals has also increased. However, when regeneration initiatives are successful, they can also result in unintended negative consequences, such as rising rents, increasing housing precarity, and displacement. For some critical scholars, the use of the term regeneration by policymakers is seen as a way to deflect criticism by subsuming gentrification within the more anodyne language of revitalization and renewal. For these scholars, the term regeneration is seen as a euphemism for gentrification. But do conceptual boundaries between regeneration and gentrification exist? If so, when does regeneration become gentrification? For scholars Libby Porter and Kate Shaw, the conceptual lines begin to blur when displacement, either direct or indirect, occurs. So in the case of Detroit, the impacts include rising rents. For example, the greater downtown experienced a 30% increase in rents between 2009 and 2015. Other impacts that the city experienced were increasing housing cost burdens, a severe a severe loss of deeply affordable housing, and evidence of displacement, both direct and indirect. So indirect displacement is also known as cultural and political displacement, and I'll define this in more detail later on. Lastly, in terms of impacts, there's also the potential for future displacement through the possible expiry of subsidized contracts and the conversion of affordable developments into market rate housing. And in fact, this is what happened to the Griswold. The conversion of the Griswold is a well-known example of direct displacement in Detroit. The building was designed by renowned architect Albert Kahn and is located downtown near the luxury Westin Hotel. For decades, it was a project-based Section 8 subsidized building that housed over 100 low-income seniors. In 2013, the Griswold was sold to Broder & Sash, a for-profit development company. The building was converted into luxury apartments and all the tenants were displaced. The building is now called the Albert, and a one-bedroom rents from $1,500 to $1,800 US a month. So to explore the extent and prevalence of displacement, I used evictions data in Detroit as a proxy for measuring direct displacement. The evictions data is from the 36th District Court, which involves over 232,000 eviction filings from 2009 to 2015. I received this data in a text file and I converted it to Excel and manipulated it so that each case could be mapped based on the defendant's address. In other words, the place where the tenant is being evicted from. I then geocoded the addresses and mapped the data using location quotients as a method to identify and compare spatial concentrations of evictions over time. Obviously, filings don't mean that someone has been evicted, which is a limitation with this data, as it doesn't indicate whether an order of eviction has been executed by a bailiff or not. However, considering that formal evictions represent a severe undercount of involuntary displacement, this data may still be a good indicator of dislocation. And as Revel Sims has noted in his evictions research, it can be a good indicator of landlord behavior and intent. The eviction location quotient maps show the shifting frontier of gentrification from 2009 to 2015. For example, eviction cases in 2009 are concentrated in the downtown and adjacent areas, but in 2015, the location quotients suggest that the number of eviction filings are decreasing in the downtown and are transitioning out to the periphery of the greater downtown, for example, to the North End. So I also analyzed eviction filings at the building level and compiled a list of the top buildings downtown with the most evictions filings. Based on what I was hearing through formal and informal discussions, I selected 3 buildings for a more detailed examination. These buildings informally were known to push out tenants with Section 8 housing choice vouchers. So I gathered all eviction filings from these buildings between 2009 and 2011, which yielded a sample of over 600 cases. I then cross-referenced tenant names with eviction filings in 2012 to 2014 to determine if their names showed up again as a defendant in a different address. In this way, we could potentially trace the movement of evicted tenants and map where they've been pushed out to. In the end, the search yielded 34 matches. I excluded common names such as Smith and I stuck to more unique names. And these tenant moves I represented as a flow map. And you can see that this flow map clearly shows that while a few tenants have managed to stay put downtown, most have been pushed outside of the downtown and the study area altogether. equitable development approaches often focus on mitigating direct displacement, which is important and necessary. However, these policies are rooted in spatial understandings of displacement and tend to ignore the non-physical everyday ways in which non-gentrifying residents experience displacement. Despite the large body of research, some scholars like Mark Davidson argue that displacement processes are still not well understood. Displacement is most commonly conceptualized as forced relocation or physical dislocation. However, reducing displacement to a simple spatial moment in time strips out the social relations that produce that space. In other words, it misses the space-place tensions that make space a social product. We need to go beyond spatial understandings of displacement and include indirect displacement. So what is indirect displacement? Peter Marcuse provided a definitional framework of displacement that went beyond spatial understandings to also include indirect forms. Even if lower income residents manage to stay put in a gentrifying neighborhood, they may still experience displacement pressure. And this occurs when the stores, restaurants, and services in the neighborhood either slowly disappear or change to cater to the taste of more affluent newcomers. So for example, the local affordable coffee place where residents would gather and socialize becomes a Starbucks or a specialty coffee place selling organic beans. Or the local diner becomes a fashionable vegan restaurant selling craft beer and boutique wine. So based on in-depth qualitative interviews with subsidized tenants in downtown Detroit, these are the major themes that emerged from my interviews. And they speak to the various ways in which tenants have experienced indirect displacement in material ways. While most tenants liked the built environment improvements, the fact that downtown is a lot cleaner and not a ghost town anymore, some feel like all the new changes, such as the new high-end restaurants and retail stores, are not for them, and they don't feel included in the new Detroit. The stores that some tenants once patronized are now almost all gone, and these are stores like an affordable grocery store and a longtime dollar store. As gentrification occurs, the use of public space and social behavior in these spaces are regulated in such a way that aligns with middle-class values and tastes. These changes can create conflicts over the use of space and result in a diminishing of social space for tenants, as the spaces they once occupied and gathered in now become less welcoming. So even if non-gentrifying residents manage to stay put in the downtown, they may still feel marginalized and subjected to unwanted surveillance as they try to occupy the social spaces they once did. All of these experiences of indirect displacement contribute to an ongoing loss of sense of place for some tenants. Without the ability to claim rights to social space, it precludes the ability to create place. And this inability to create and inhabit place impacts their right to the city, their ability to shape the city after their heart's desire, in the words of David Harvey. And this is also how gentrification occurs, by removing or diminishing the right to the city for some and increasing it for others. So development is obviously necessary in shrinking cities such as Detroit. After years of deferred maintenance, the housing stock and the city's infrastructure are severely deteriorated in many areas, and improvement was desperately needed. The question for planners, though, is how to encourage much needed redevelopment in a way that also brings about socially just outcomes. Or to paraphrase Susan Feinstein, how can we promote growth and equity? Expanding our conception of displacement to include indirect displacement is central to bringing about more just and equitable development. By understanding the different ways in which people feel connected to their neighborhoods helps to identify potential ruptures and disconnections, which is an important first step to developing proactive strategies to mitigate indirect displacement and foster a continued sense of belonging. So one approach is to institute specific strategies to identify, retain, and enhance spaces of belonging. Planners can begin this process by asking a simple question. Where do non-gentrifying residents feel most at home and most connected to the community? Once these sites of belonging have been identified through grassroots planning and engagement, these spaces could then be protected and enhanced through the use of value capture tools such as community benefits agreements. So to sum up, this study has detailed the negative impacts of gentrification, though there are also positive impacts such as built environment improvements and increases in property tax revenues. However, when revitalization efforts are successful in generating reinvestment and growth, they may also result in severe negative consequences, especially for vulnerable populations. Planners can be more proactive in anticipating these negative impacts to ensure that the benefits of the resurgence are equally distributed. And the question of who benefits should be a central concern for planners and policymakers. The rationale for this is simple. Without some kind of intervention, disadvantaged groups tend not to reap the benefits of gentrification. Instead, they bear the brunt of the negative impacts. And I've also just presented my argument for the need to expand equitable planning initiatives, as indirect displacement raises important issues for planners. As redevelopment and neighborhood upgrading occur, the inclusion of low-income and marginalized voices is important to achieving a more just and equitable city. In the end, planning is not just about land use. It is also about fostering a sense of belonging. And on that note, I'll conclude. So thank you all for your attention, for listening, and I look forward to your questions. I'll stop sharing.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much, Julie. That was great. As Julie said, we're just going to jump straight into Q&A. I have a few questions to start, but please do send in your questions. There's the Q&A function there at the bottom of your screen. You can type in your questions and we'll get to them. So Julie, first, I just want to have a few quick questions that I'm interested in. The first has to do, your presentation notes about at the beginning, especially the important role that the private sector played and that philanthropic organizations played in Detroit. And as you noted, the Detroit example certainly it's an interesting case study for Canadian cities like Toronto and Vancouver that are facing not the same issues, certainly issues around gentrification. And here there's an argument that government needs to play a much larger role, especially when we're talking about building deeply affordable housing. So can you maybe speak about what Detroit shows us about the potential roles of the private and public sector in this work?
Yeah, in Detroit especially, the role of community activists, grassroots organizations, CDCs, community development corporations were also very active in trying to preserve affordable housing and also help develop affordable housing. So just to give the city the credit that it deserves, it did intend and has implemented certain programs to help preserve, say, naturally occurring, what they call naturally occurring affordable housing, and also to preserve the existing subsidized housing developments as affordable housing. Because after what happened to the Griswold, they realized that a lot of subsidized contracts were at risk of expiring in the next few years, and these were located in areas that were gentrifying. So they wanted to protect those buildings. So they implemented a notice requirement, and they're working actively to protect those buildings. So just to say that they have done quite a few. They've tried hard to kind of address the issues and to help mitigate the impacts of revitalization. Of course, more can be done, right? Cities, especially cities that are trying to recover from years of decline, that they have limited fiscal resources that they can employ to, to bring about much needed improvements. So they have to kind of balance the tensions between, say, growth-related goals and also meeting social needs. So the intention is good. Like, they want to do more and to utilize their resources to the best that they can and maximize those resources to help mitigate those impacts. But planners can do more to help more vulnerable tenants.
Right, yeah. Actually, we have a first question from the audience, so I'll ask it. So they are asking, what role have community benefit agreements played? Do existing communities have sufficient political power to negotiate concrete quantitative benefits?
There is. So the city of Detroit, they passed a community benefits ordinance. This was after some years of inactivity when Council President Brenda Jones kind of first brought forward this community benefits ordinance. But through community activism, they actually brought it forward to a vote. They have these propositions in the States. So when you vote for president, say, this was in 2016 when Trump was elected, there was also on the ballot was a vote, do you agree with this community benefits ordinance? And there's two different versions of this community benefits ordinance. One was sort of the people's proposal, which had a bit more intense requirements for community benefits. And it would apply to projects that were, I think it was like over $15 million. And then there was another one that was put forward by the administration, the city's administration. And that would only apply to projects that were worth 75 million. So in the end, the administration won in terms of the community benefits that went forward. But it was critiqued by a lot of grassroots organizers and activists as being more about process rather than delivering the needed benefits to communities who are most affected by redevelopment. There are other scholars who really looked at this, like Lisa Berglund and Dalhousie. So I would kind of direct people to kind of look at her work. She's really kind of looked into those community groups and what happened and how they managed to actually bring about much needed benefits.
Great, and we have another specific question on this. To your knowledge, did any of the community benefit agreements include local employment and residential equity components?
There was some, yes, and I think they were like, now it's starting. It's funny because just as my research was ending, there was some, especially in the downtown with Gilbert's major developments, Hudson's Block, Monroe Block, that they would actually reach that threshold that was needed for these community benefits. And a lot of people were actually organizing to be able to participate in an informed way in order to extract the most amount of benefits for the public. So there's kind of a lot of activity around that.
That's great. A question here about, so in conjunction with bricks and mortar development, has there been any technology infrastructure development? Have there been technology jobs created? Have they been equitably distributed? Do you know of the technology sector, how that's being played out in Detroit?
They did create like there was a tech incubator sector, like a district in the what they call like tech town, and this is sort of the north of the study in their area, the northern end of the study area, and they were trying to create sort of that tech incubator, and they were creating what they're trying to implement like more high speed internet connections. There was like rocket fiber that was it was an idea by one of Gilbert's employees that they then created this another company out of called, I think it was called Rocket Fiber, and it was so there was part of that type of innovation that was happening, and I believe also, again, this is a sort of after my research period, but the Michigan Central Station, which was vacant for many years, Ford has now taken that over. And they've created their innovation hub that's located in Corktown in the Michigan Central Station, which is located in Corktown. And their idea is that that's where they have the autonomous cars. That's where they're going to be doing research on sort of those technologically driven vehicles.
Right. Yeah.
In AI.
So a question about what you started talking about at the beginning, the tax incentives. And they note, so one interesting issue is that if tax incentives target new development and new residents, the question is, do those residents who already live there or who have been there for some time feel that it is unfair that they don't get some kind of support? Yeah, and I mean, that ties to the indirect displacement a little bit as well.
Yeah, in terms of that divide between the old residents and the new residents, because it is like it can be quite a substantial tax break for newcomers that I think the people who were there and kind of stuck it out and stayed and worked hard to revitalize and to maintain that neighborhood and also to stabilize it so that, you know, this type of redevelopment could occur, they kind of feel the short end of the stick in terms of they didn't really reap the benefits of any tax breaks or tax incentives.
So, I mean, one follow-up question is who pays for the tax incentives? Is that is it coming on municipality? Is it, yeah?
That the city then, forgoes over that period of time. And then where it is like if either 15-year period or 17-year period for more of a historic structure. They start phasing it in the last 3 years that you then get back to what the actual rate would be.
Right. And I think that opens up the interesting question as well of would it be one way to keep people in place in the neighborhood, is it to offer them equal or more incentives than the people who you're trying to bring in, or what, are there other methods from this sort of tax incentive perspective that have come up in your research?
Yeah, like the NEZ homestead program was meant to kind of help stabilize neighborhoods and to incentivize existing homeowners to fix up their existing housing. But it wasn't compared to the new and rehabilitated program. It just didn't compare in terms of the amount of tax breaks you actually did receive.
And in terms of those new developments, so one, you note obviously that some of the impacts of revitalization are rising rents and deeply affordable, like the loss of deeply affordable housing, displacement. You can imagine something like inclusionary zoning, which you obviously know about, that kind of regulation could help, but could that alone counteract these consequences, or do you need more than just getting some affordable units in new development?
Yeah, in of itself, it's a useful too, but you need much more.
Right. And do you have in your research, have other measures come up that you can speak to, or?
Well, it's like it'd be a whole strategy that they would have to implement, where they're actually aggressively investing in eviction prevention programs in order to preserve what they called, naturally occurring affordable housing, and also to create programs where they can help people remain in place as these buildings receive the improvements and the renovations that are needed, given that maintenance has been deferred for so long. And the city again did have certain programs, and they've worked actively to kind of help tenants remain in place. Especially when these buildings are bought up by developers like Broder and Sash, and they have tried to really address that issue. And they actually created a Stay Midtown program. This was actually created by Midtown Detroit Inc. And they really try to help people remain in the Midtown area, given that the fact that the rents were also rising.
Right. So have any of the there's another question from the audience here. Have any of the community foundations that were instrumental in driving this revitalization conducted any systematic evaluations of the social spatial impacts of their investments?
Again, I stopped at the time when I did stop my intense research period. It was at that time, it didn't seem there was actually no, there was one report that did look at displacement, and they tried to really address this issue. So there was a movement towards equitable development. I can't remember the name of the organization. I think Capital Impact Partners, and they created a displacement report, and they really tried to raise awareness of this. And they were looking at the rent burdens and how it's been affected in recent years, and then also looked at direct displacement.
Right. Next question, back to the tax incentives, because you know our audience. So, are there overlapping tax increment finance zones, and does that confuse the application of the tax incentives? It does seem like it was a fairly complex structure that you presented to some extent.
I think it was just that you would combine, if I understand the question, that people would be eligible for certain tax incentives depending on the geographic location of that, and they would then avail themselves of that tax incentive.
Okay. So it wasn't, the tax incentives were targeted to different kinds of sort of housing and different kinds of developments, and so that's how it was.
Like developers could avail themselves of multiple.
Right. Okay.
So it wasn't just they weren't just isolated to one particular program.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
They could stack it. As I understand it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense, and I think that applies even certainly state and municipal, from what you were talking about with Dan Gilbert as well. So there were multiple ways to access. Yeah. Next question is about the innovative food projects. So they say that in the social innovation sector, we hear a lot about innovative food projects in Detroit. Are they simply a few small projects in the midst of larger negative trends?
Again, so that wasn't the focus of my research. I think a lot of people like Sarah Safransky looked at sort of green infrastructure and looked at it very critically. But yeah, there was quite a bit of, like, in terms of urban agriculture, in terms of creating, trying to create community land trusts out of these urban farms as well. And a lot of people were engaged in that. And also, so it was a lot of community-driven farms in certain areas, but some were, you also had the commercial farms.
Right. And someone had a question about the LRT line, which
Okay.
I'm not sure how much you know, but we'll throw it out there. Asking if you know much about the ridership, the unintended ridership of the LRT line, and whether it will effectively serve low-income residents. And I guess an interesting question with that is just it's interesting. You know, you're talking about this downtown area, the LRT line. I don't know. I imagine it's supposed to connect people into the downtown area. So
from the waterfront along Woodward and all the way up to the very north of the greater downtown.
So is that serving places that people are being displaced to? Is it, or is it, you know,
it doesn't go all the way. Basically, where the greater downtown area, the sort of the boundaries that I showed.
Right. Okay.
Essentially from like the waterfront to New Center.
Mm-hmm. And so do you think it would effectively serve low-income residents, or is this sort of part of the issue around?
They made it free for a while, I think just to kind of encourage ridership and to get people to use it.
Mm-hmm.
So when I went back in 2017 and I was just writing it like up and down, and it was free. And a lot of people were kind of using it and getting used to it. I think the intention is to connect it to, obviously, to go further north and to connect it to the suburbs. I don't know if people have also used or are aware of the People Mover in downtown, which is basically this monorail that goes downtown.
Right.
And originally it was supposed to connect to the suburbs as well and help to bring people from the suburbs into the downtown, but it never got past. It never connected because there was that racial animus.
Right.
They didn't want easy connections from the city into those suburbs.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. So one thing you talk about, which is it connects to something that IMFG has been working on, is sort of at the end you mentioned the importance of you know, hearing more voices as part of these processes. And so maybe could you speak a little bit more about how you, like, if improving public consultation, how you see that working? How do you, especially when you talk about indirect displacement, how do you include more individuals who have been indirectly displaced or are potentially could be indirectly displaced?
Yeah, and the IMFG panel that was achieving one city for all, and was sort of talking about more inclusive governance, or really touches on a lot of these issues as well. How do you get voices heard at the table, voices that normally are not heard, right? Yeah. So you can start through grassroots planning. So planners can kind of help encourage and help facilitate those bottom-up processes, and have communities kind of engage with the question of, you know, where do you feel most connected to the neighborhood? Where do you feel most at home? And ahead of any development. So there's a lot of great organizing going on in Parkdale and in other places, Jane Finch, where they are actually trying to address those questions ahead of any development, but also to enable community members to be able to be educated on terms of like the development process and planning, and how they can meaningfully engage and be included in this process.
And, you know, that's an interesting question. You know, there's the work you can do ahead of time, and, you know, but to some extent in Detroit, the area you're studying, and it's continuously gentrifying, but is there a point, like, what would a place like Detroit or a neighborhood like the area you studied, you know, for the people who have been indirectly displaced, is there, you know, is it a different process to try to repair that, you know? Yeah. How would,
like, retroactively? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Or just, you know, the downtown Detroit is where it is now, but there are, I'm sure, still people living there who were living before this all happened. So what does it look like? You know, what does a process look like now to sort of help repair that situation?
It could be just kind of assessing what spaces are most welcoming to certain people. So, like, what are potential, or what are spaces of inclusion and exclusion? And who would feel welcome in this space, or who would not feel welcome in this space? Right. And trying to kind of think about it in that way.
Yeah. I wonder if, and this will be our last question as we're running out of time, but, there's a question about, we've talked about government and we've talked about the private sector and philanthropic sector. I suppose there's a responsibility of the gentrifying residents. You spoke about non-gentrifying and gentrifying residents. Is there something that comes to an individual level of what gentrifying residents should do?
That's a great question. It's something I kind of grappled with as well, because as a researcher coming in, I was also part of that gentrifying process. And it's something, I think it's a good question. I think it's something that personally you should kind of try to come to grips with, and then see how you can contribute to the community in a non-patronizing way.
Right.
And be aware of the power imbalances and the power relations that are at play.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I think that's a good place then. I think that is, as you mentioned some neighborhoods in Toronto specifically where these forces are at play, but certainly, there's a lot of cities in Canada that are facing these questions. So your presentation really was great at highlighting sort of what happened in Detroit, why that happened, but also some of the tools that we might use, not just in Detroit, but in other places to try to counteract that. So thank you very much, Julie. That was a fantastic presentation. I'll just, to close, mention that today's event has been recorded and it will be available on our website in the days to come. So if you know people who wanted to attend and couldn't, please do share that link when it's up so they can watch the video. And I'll just say thanks everyone for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day. I'm sure you'll want to hear about all the money that the federal government has now decided to spend on us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.